When interacting with multiple input fields, you can provide a good user experience by allowing the fields to be navigated through using buttons that are provided by the keyboard. In Android development, these have always been referred to as IME actions, something that we still have access to in Jetpack Compose under the name of keyboard options. In our authentication screen, we're going to want to utilize some of these options to allow customizing the keyboard depending on the expected input content, navigating from the email address field to the password field, and then submitting the form when the password field is in focus. These options together will allow the users to navigate and submit the form, seamlessly completing the authentication flow without needing to specifically interact with the UI components via touch input. To add these functionalities, we're going to start by customizing the options provided by the email address text field. For this, we'll use the keyboard actions class to specify the keyboard type that is to be used for the email input field. This means that if supported, our keyboard will be laid out specifically for email input, showing the @symbol and clipboard options. Except this time, we're going to declare the keyboard type as password input. So that we can support navigation across input fields via the keyboard, we're going to need to manage the focus for these fields ourselves. For this, we're going to need to utilize the focus requester class. This can be assigned to a composable via a modifier and then used elsewhere to request a focus on the given composable. We'll start here by defining a reference to a focus requester for our password text field. With this defined, we're now going to need to assign it to our password text field. This can be done using the focus requester modifier, which allows for the focus requester reference to be used to request focus for the composable that it has been assigned to. With this focus requester now in place, we're going to need to trigger the focus request. This is going to happen when the user interacts with the next IME action that we're going to enable via the keyboard options. Before we can offer this though, we need to implement a handler for it. This property takes a keyboard actions instant used to provide handlers for each of the available IME actions. In our case, for the email address text field, we're just going to provide an implementation for the onNext action. When this onNext action is triggered, we're going to want to trigger the lambda that we've just defined for our email input composable. We'll update our preview to a blank block so we can see a visual representation of a composable. And now hopping back over to our authentication form composable, we need to actually implement this onNext clicked callback. What we'll do now is we'll use our password focus requester to trigger the request focus function. When this function call is triggered, the focus will be requested for our password text field, which is a composable that our focus requester is attached to. If the request is successful, this text field will come into focus, allowing the user to move between the email address and password text fields without needing to manually interact with either of the composables. We're going to do a similar thing for our password input form now. As well as being able to navigate between these, we want the user to be able to submit the content when they're done with inputting their password. So we're going to do a similar thing here and add a keyboard action to our password input, except this time in the form of the onDone operation. When this is triggered, we're going to want the user to be able to submit the authentication request. So we add a new lambda argument to our password input composable. This doesn't need to take any arguments. And then we'll trigger this from within our keyboard actions. We'll then need to implement this callback within the authentication form composable. So when this occurs, we're going to want to pass the event back up to our parent. So for our authentication form, we're going to add another callback, which will be called onAuthenticateAuthentication. Again, no arguments required here, and we're simply going to call this from within the onDone block on the password input composable. Going back up to the parent of the authentication content, we can handle this block by calling the handle event function and using the authenticate event. We don't need to pass any information here because the state already has a reference to the email and password. We'll just update our preview so that we can view a visual representation of these changes. So now, at this point, the user will be able to trigger events. However, we actually need to add these actions so that they're visible to the user. At this point, we've implemented the logic which will handle these triggers, but we need to actually display these actions to the user. We're going to hop back over to the keyboard options and set the actions for both of our input fields. For the password, we're going to set the IME action to done, which will show a done icon within the keyboard. And for the email input field, we're going to display the next IME action. Now, the user will be able to see these actions in the keyboard, trigger them to move between the fields, and then finally submit the form.